The text arrived at 3:47 p.m. on a Tuesday, right as I was finishing a Bach invention with my private student. 16-year-old Sophie was struggling with the fingering in measure 12 when my phone buzzed on the piano bench beside me. Sold your piano for $500. We need the money. Don't make a scene about it. Jake. I stared at the screen for exactly 10 seconds before my student noticed my sudden stillness. Miss Hartwell? Are you okay? I forced a smile and slipped the phone into my jacket pocket. Let's work on that left-hand passage again, Sophie. Remember, it's all about the wrist motion. But my mind wasn't on Bach anymore. It was on the 1925 Steinway Model M that had been sitting in my parents' living room for the past 3 years. The piano I'd been restoring piece by piece. The piano my grandfather had left me in his will. The piano worth $2.8 million that my brother had just sold for $500. After Sophie left, I sat alone in my teaching studio and typed back, "I understand." Jake's response was immediate, finally being reasonable. Mom and Dad are relieved. I almost laughed. Reasonable. If only he knew what reasonable actually looked like. 27 minutes later, my phone rang. Unknown number with a Manhattan area code. Hello. Is this Elena Hartwell? The voice was cultured, excited. My name is Charles Morrison from Morrison & Associates Fine Arts. I believe I just purchased a piano that belongs to you. My heart started beating faster. What kind of piano? A 1925 Steinway Model M. Serial number 241847. The gentleman who sold it to me mentioned it belonged to his sister, but when I got it back to my workshop. He paused and I could hear him moving around. Miss Hartwell, are you aware of what you have here? Tell me. This isn't just any Steinway. This is one of the experimental models from Steinway's golden period. The soundboard is original Sitka spruce. The action is completely intact and the case. Another pause. Ms. Hartwell, this piano was owned by Vladimir Horowitz from 1926 to 1943. I found the authentication papers tucked inside the bench. The room spun slightly. What did you say? Vladimir Horowitz. One of the greatest pianists who ever lived. He owned this piano during some of his most famous recording sessions. There are only 3 of these experimental Steinways known to exist, and this is the only one in private hands. I closed my eyes. My grandfather had never mentioned Horowitz. He'd only told me it was a good piano that had some history. But Grandpa had always been modest about his possessions. He'd grown up during the Depression when talking about valuable things made you a target. Mr. Morrison, what's a piano like that worth? Conservatively, $2.8 million. At auction, possibly more. Miss Hartwell, your brother sold me a museum-quality instrument for $500. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling of my modest teaching studio. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here I was, sitting in a small room with second-hand furniture and worn carpet, while my family thought I was too poor to own anything valuable. Mr. Morrison, can I ask you something? Of course. Are you a good person? He chuckled, confused. I like to think so. Why? Because I'm about to tell you something that might change how you feel about your purchase. I spent the next 10 minutes explaining the situation. My grandfather's will. My brother's financial problems. My parents' assumption that I was just a struggling piano teacher who couldn't afford to maintain an expensive instrument. What I didn't tell Mr. Morrison was that I wasn't struggling at all. Elena Hartwell, the piano teacher, was just my public persona. In reality, I was Elena Hartwell, the composer, whose symphonic works had been performed by the New York Philharmonic, the Boston Symphony, and the London Symphony Orchestra. My last commission piece had earned me more money than my brother made in 3 years at his sales job. The modest teaching studio was deliberate. I'd learned early in my career that success in classical music made people uncomfortable. When I told my family that the Vienna Philharmonic had commissioned a piece from me, my mother had asked if I was finally going to get a real job with benefits. When I'd mentioned traveling to London for a premiere, my father had suggested I look into teaching at the local community college instead. So I'd stopped talking about my real work. I let them think I was Elena, the piano teacher who barely scraped by, rather than Elena, the composer who owned a penthouse apartment in Manhattan and a house in the Berkshires. It was easier than constantly defending my choices to people who couldn't understand that artistic success didn't always look like their version of traditional stability. Mr. Morrison, I said finally, I have a proposition for you. I'm listening. Keep the piano. But I want you to do something for me first. After we finished our conversation, I sat in the quiet of my studio, surrounded by the sheet music of my latest symphony, a piece the Chicago Symphony Orchestra had commissioned for their 2024 season. The commission alone was worth more than my parents' house, but they didn't know that. They thought I was giving piano lessons to children for $25 an hour. I pulled out my phone and called my assistant, Marina. Elena? How did the lesson go with Sophie? Marina, I need you to prepare some documents for me. Financial statements, portfolio summaries, and the authentication papers for Grandpa's piano. Is everything okay? My family just sold a $2.8 million piano for $500. There was a long pause. Should I call the lawyers? Not yet. First, I'm going to give them a chance to understand what they've done. 2 hours later, I was standing on my parents' front porch in Westchester, holding a leather portfolio that would change my family's understanding of everything. The house looked exactly the same as it had when I was growing up. White colonial with black shutters, perfectly manicured lawn, 2-car garage that Jake had been using as storage for his latest failed business venture. My mother opened the door wearing the worried expression she'd worn constantly since Jake's third business failure in 5 years. Elena, what are you doing here? Jake said you were upset about the piano. Can I come in, Mom? She stepped aside and I could see my father in his usual recliner, reading the Wall Street Journal with the intense concentration of someone who understood numbers but had never quite figured out how to make them work in his favor. Jake was sprawled on the couch, scrolling through his phone with the satisfied expression of someone who thought he'd solved a major problem. The living room felt smaller than I remembered. The space where the Steinway had stood for 3 years was now occupied by a folding table covered with Jake's business papers. Invoices, contracts, and what looked like a stack of overdue notices. Elena, Dad said without looking up from his paper. We're sorry about the piano, but Jake needed the money for rent. We couldn't let him get evicted again. It's okay, Dad. Jake looked up from his phone and I could see the relief on his face. See? I told you she'd understand. It was just sitting there collecting dust anyway. Nobody ever played it. That stung more than it should have. I'd played that piano every time I visited, usually late at night when the rest of the family was asleep. Some of my best compositions had started with late-night improvisations on those keys. But they'd never noticed because they were never awake to hear it. Besides, Jake continued, it's not like you could afford to keep it maintained properly. Those old pianos need constant tuning, climate control, all kinds of expensive stuff. I sat down across from him and placed the portfolio on the coffee table. Jake, who did you sell the piano to? Some antique dealer from the city. Guy seemed to know what he was talking about. Said it was a nice piece but needed work. What was his name? Morrison something. Charles Morrison, I think. Why? I opened the portfolio and pulled out the first document. Charles Morrison's business card and a detailed biography. Charles Morrison from Morrison & Associates Fine Arts. One of the most respected piano dealers in the world. He's the guy the Metropolitan Opera calls when they need to authenticate historical instruments. Jake shrugged, but I could see uncertainty creeping into his expression. Hey. So he called me after he got the piano back to his workshop. My father finally looked up from his newspaper. Called you why? To tell me what you actually sold him. I handed Jake the authentication papers. These were hidden inside the piano bench. Mr. Morrison found them during his initial inspection. I watched Jake's face as he read. His expression moved from confusion to disbelief to something approaching panic. This says the piano was owned by Vladimir Horowitz. That's right. My mother sat down heavily in the chair next to my father. Who's Vladimir Horowitz? One of the greatest pianists who ever lived, Mom. He owned Grandpa's piano from 1926 to 1943. Used it for some of his most famous recordings. The room was silent except for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. Another antique that had belonged to my grandfather, though thankfully one that Jake hadn't decided to sell. Elena, my father said slowly, what is a piano like that worth? I pulled out the formal appraisal document and handed it to him. The letterhead was from Steinway and Sons themselves, and the assessment was signed by their chief restoration expert. The number at the bottom made him actually gasp. $2.8 million. That's the conservative estimate, I said quietly. At auction with the Horowitz provenance it could go significantly higher. Jake was staring at the papers like they might spontaneously combust. But I only got 500. Because you sold a museum-quality instrument to someone who assumed you knew what you were selling. My mother was pale, her hands shaking slightly as she reached for the appraisal. Elena, we had no idea. Your grandfather never said anything about. Grandpa didn't know about the Horowitz connection either. But he knew it was valuable. That's why he left it to me specifically in his will. Jake stood up abruptly, pacing to the window that overlooked the backyard where we'd played as children. We have to get it back. We have to tell this Morrison guy there was a mistake. Actually, I said, we don't. Everyone turned to look at me. Mr. Morrison made a legal purchase. You offered the piano for $500, he accepted. The fact that you didn't know its value doesn't invalidate the sale. Jake spun around, his face flushed. So we just lose almost $3 million because I didn't know? You lose almost $3 million because you sold something that wasn't yours to sell. The words hung in the air like smoke. My father's face went from confused to angry to something approaching shame. What do you mean wasn't his to sell? I pulled out the copy of my grandfather's will, highlighted in yellow where it specifically mentioned the piano. Grandpa left the piano to me. Jake had no legal right to sell it. But it was in our house, my mother protested. It's been here for 3 years. Because I asked you to keep it here while I was establishing my career and traveling for work. I was paying for its maintenance, its insurance, even the climate control system Dad installed in the living room. That got my father's attention. You were paying for the climate control? The monthly bills went to my accountant. I've been covering the costs of keeping the piano properly maintained since the day it arrived. Jake sat back down heavily, running his hands through his hair. Elena, I'm sorry. We thought it was just taking up space. I thought you didn't want it. You never asked what I wanted. You never asked if I could afford the maintenance. You just assumed that because I teach piano lessons I must be broke. Well, aren't you? The question came from my father and it wasn't mean-spirited. He genuinely seemed confused. I almost laughed. No, Dad. I'm not broke. But you live in that tiny apartment and you drive that old car and you're always talking about budgeting for things. Because I'm careful with money. Because I learned from watching you struggle when your business went under in 2018. Because I don't believe in spending money just to impress people. My mother leaned forward. Elena, if you're not struggling, why didn't you help Jake with his rent? Because Jake never asked for help. He just took something that belonged to me and sold it. We can fix this, my father said firmly, the problem solver in him emerging. We'll call this Morrison fellow, explain the situation. Surely he'll understand. I smiled. I already called him Dad. And I reached into my purse and pulled out a cashier's check, placing it on the coffee table where everyone could see it. $2,800,000. Pay to the order of Elena Hartwell. My mother actually whispered. He paid you. He paid me. Jake was staring at the check like it was a mirage. But why? He already bought it for $500. Because he's an honest dealer who doesn't profit from other people's mistakes. And because I made him a different offer. What kind of offer? My father asked. I pulled out the final document from the portfolio. A contract between Morrison and Associates and the Elena Hartwell Foundation. I sold him the piano for its full appraised value with conditions. He has to display it in his showroom with a plaque explaining its history. Music students can schedule time to play it. It stays available for the public to experience. Why would you do that? Jake asked. Because Grandpa would have wanted it to be heard, not locked away in someone's private collection. And because... I paused, looking at each of their faces. Because I don't actually need the money. The silence that followed was profound. What do you mean? My mother asked carefully. I reached for my phone and opened my banking app, turning the screen so they could all see the balance. The number made Jake actually choke on air. $4.2 million? That's just my checking account, I said quietly. My investment portfolio is significantly larger. My father set down his newspaper completely, staring at me like I was a stranger. Elena, how is that possible? I'm a composer, Dad. I write symphonic music. The New York Philharmonic performed my 3rd symphony last season. The Chicago Symphony commissioned my 4th. I have contracts with orchestras in Boston, London, Vienna, and Berlin. Jake found his voice. But you're a piano teacher. I teach piano because I love teaching. But it's not how I make my living. How much? My mother started then stopped herself. How much do I make? Last year my commissions totaled $1.8 million. That's not including royalties from recordings or performance fees. The room was silent again. My father was staring at the check on the coffee table, my mother was staring at me, and Jake was staring at his phone like it might have answers. Why didn't you tell us? My father asked finally. I looked around the living room where I'd grown up, at the family photos on the mantel, at the space where my grandfather's piano had sat for 3 years while I paid thousands of dollars to keep it in perfect condition. Because every time I tried to talk about my work, you'd ask when I was going to get a real job. Because when I mentioned traveling for performances, you'd suggest I find something more stable. Because you seemed to think that being an artist meant being broke. My mother's eyes filled with tears. We were trying to help. I know. But I didn't need help. I needed you to trust that I knew what I was doing with my life. So when you said you were budgeting, my father started. I was budgeting for a new house in the Berkshires. When I said I couldn't afford to go on vacation with you last summer, it was because I was recording an album with the London Symphony Orchestra. Jake was still processing. So what happens now? Now you learn that actions have consequences. You stole and sold a multi-million-dollar instrument. That's grand theft. It's a felony. Elena, my father started, but I held up a hand. However, since I got full compensation and Mr. Morrison is happy with his purchase, I'm not pressing charges. But this is the last time any of you make decisions about my property without asking. We understand, my mother said quickly. Do you? Because this isn't just about the piano. This is about respect. About seeing me as an adult who's capable of managing her own affairs. I stood up and gathered the documents, leaving the check on the table. I'm going to leave this with you for tonight. Why? Jake asked. Because I want you to think about what almost happened. You almost stole $3 million from your sister because you assumed she was too unsuccessful to own anything valuable. Elena, we're sorry, my father said. We had no idea you were doing so well. That's exactly the problem, Dad. You never asked. You just assumed that because my life looks different from yours it must be wrong. I headed toward the door, then paused. Oh, and Jake? Mr. Morrison has your information on file. If you ever try to sell something that belongs to me again, he'll be calling the police immediately. So will every other reputable dealer in the country. Elena, wait, my mother called. What about us? Are we okay? I turned back to look at them. My brother, who had stolen from me without a second thought because he assumed I had nothing worth stealing. My parents, who had enabled him because they thought I couldn't afford to own anything valuable. But I also saw the shame on their faces. The genuine confusion and regret. These were people who had raised me, supported my early music education, driven me to lessons and recitals even when money was tight. We're family, I said finally. But things are going to be different from now on. Different how? Different in that you're going to start treating me like the successful adult I've been for the past 5 years. Different in that you're going to ask before making assumptions about my life. And different in that if you need help you ask for it instead of taking it. 3 days later my mother called. Elena? I've been thinking about what you said. And I looked up your symphonies online. I found recordings on Spotify. Her voice was thick with emotion. Sweetheart, I had no idea. They're beautiful. I was sitting in my penthouse apartment looking out at Central Park, working on the orchestration for a piece that would premiere at Carnegie Hall in 6 months. Thank you, Mom. I found articles about you too. Reviews from the New York Times, interviews in classical music magazines. They call you one of the most promising composers of your generation. I'm just doing what I love. But why didn't you tell us? Why didn't you show us these articles, these recordings? I set down my pencil and leaned back in my chair. Because when I tried to share my excitement about a good review, you'd changed the subject to ask if I'd thought about applying for jobs at the local school district. When I mentioned that a symphony had been well received, you'd suggest I use my musical skills to teach elementary school. We were worried about your financial security. I understand that. But I needed you to trust that I could create my own security. Elena, I'm proud of you. I'm sorry it took us so long to say that. A week later Jake called. Elena, I've been thinking about the money. The check you left. What about it? I can't take it. Not all of it. I know I screwed up, but taking $3 million from my sister. That's not who I want to be. I was surprised. What are you proposing? Keep most of it. But let me take enough to get back on my feet properly. Not just pay rent, but maybe go back to school, learn something that actually interests me instead of jumping from one get-rich-quick scheme to another. What interests you? Music, actually. I've been listening to your symphonies and I had no idea how complex composition was. I'd like to understand it better. Maybe learn audio engineering, work with recording studios. 2 months later, Jake started classes at Berklee College of Music. My father, meanwhile, had become my unofficial publicist, telling everyone he met about his daughter, the composer. My mother had started attending local symphony performances, texting me photos from concert halls across New England. 6 months later, when the New York Philharmonic premiered my Fourth Symphony, my entire family was in the audience. Jake, who had discovered a genuine talent for audio engineering, helped record the performance. My parents sat in the front row, tears streaming down their faces as they heard music their daughter had created being performed by one of the world's greatest orchestras. After the performance, as we stood in the lobby surrounded by musicians and critics and other composers, my father pulled me aside. "Elena, I need to apologize." "Dad, we've been through this." "No, let me finish. I need to apologize not just for what happened with the piano, but for all the years I didn't see you. Really see you. I was so worried about your financial security that I missed the fact that you'd already created something much more valuable than security. You'd created art." I hugged him then in the lobby of Lincoln Center, surrounded by the sound of my music still echoing in the concert hall. "I love you, Dad. I love you too. And I'm proud of you. Not just because you're successful, but because you chose to build something beautiful in the world." A year later, I established the Elena Hartwell Foundation for Young Composers, funded in part by the sale of my grandfather's piano. The foundation provides grants and mentorship for aspiring composers from low-income families, kids who love music but whose parents worry about the financial realities of an artistic career. Every few months, I visit Mr. Morrison's showroom to play Grandpa's piano, now displayed with a plaque that reads, "The Horowitz Steinway on permanent loan from the Elena Hartwell Foundation, in memory of all the dreamers who understood that some things are more valuable than money." It's exactly where the piano belongs. Being heard, being appreciated, inspiring the next generation of musicians who might otherwise never get the chance to touch an instrument of that caliber. Just like I'd finally found where I belonged, being seen and valued for exactly who I'd always been.